It was back in 2014 when this happened. I was 29 at the time, living in Manchester, England. Life was heavy back then. I'd just gotten out of a long relationship, the kind where you don't really know who you are after it ends. I needed space, something away from city noise and work stress. A friend from work, Liam, told me about a place his uncle owned. An old cabin up near the Lake District, tucked deep into the woods, not far from a little village called Sedbergh. It sounded like what I needed. Quiet, nature, and no one asking me how I was doing every 5 minutes. The cabin itself was simple. Built maybe in the 1950s, all old wood and stone with a sloping roof and a tiny porch out front. Liam said nobody had been up there for a couple of years. His uncle used to rent it out but gave up after some vandals wrecked it one summer. He warned me it might be rough inside, damp, dusty, cold, but that was fine by me. I wasn't looking for a luxury spa weekend. I just wanted to sit by a fire with a book and not think about anything. I packed my old car with basics: food, water, sleeping bag, a torch, a couple of paperbacks, and a thick jacket. It was early November, cold enough that your breath hung in the air even at noon. I set off mid-morning on a Saturday, took the M6 north, turned off onto smaller and smaller roads until eventually, the trees grew thicker and the traffic disappeared altogether. The last mile or two was a dirt track, half swallowed by overgrowth. If Liam hadn't drawn me a little map, I would have missed the turn completely. When I pulled up, the place looked exactly like I pictured it. Weather-beaten and lonely, tucked between tall pines and birches that rattled in the wind. A low stone wall ran around the property, half collapsed in places. The windows were dark. The door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp and old wood. Dust hung in the air like smoke. The main room had a fireplace, a battered armchair, a little kitchen area with a sink and an old gas stove. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom and a tiny bathroom. Everything looked untouched, just forgotten. I dropped my bags, opened the windows to air it out, and got a fire going with the logs stacked by the hearth. The flames threw a soft light around the room, chasing the damp chill into the corners. The first day was peaceful. I unpacked, cleaned a bit, walked the property. There was a pond behind the cabin, black and still. A few trails led off into the trees. No other houses were visible, not even distant lights through the woods. It was what I wanted, total isolation. That first night, the woods were alive with sound. Wind groaning through the trees, branches tapping against the walls, the occasional hoot of an owl. Took a while to get used to it. Every little creak made me tense up, expecting, what exactly? I didn't know. I told myself to relax, that this was exactly why I came here. No people, no pressure. The second day, I decided to explore a bit deeper into the woods. I followed one of the trails leading north, rough and overgrown. Felt like nobody had walked it in years. The ground was soft underfoot, carpeted in fallen leaves. The trees closed overhead, blocking out the gray sky. About a mile in, I found an old shed, half collapsed under the weight of years. Rusted tools littered the ground. An old wheelbarrow lay on its side, one wheel missing. I poked around a bit but didn't linger. The woods had a different feel here, heavier, quieter, like the trees were pressing in. I turned back after only 20 minutes. That afternoon, as I sat on the porch reading, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye, movement between the trees. I looked up, but there was nothing there, just the trees swaying. I told myself it was probably a deer or a fox. The woods were full of life. It was normal. That night, though, something changed. I woke around 2 in the morning. The fire had burned low, throwing faint, red light. I could hear the wind outside, stronger now, making the cabin creak and groan. I sat up, heart pounding for no good reason. It felt like something had woken me, Not a noise, exactly, but a feeling, a sense of being watched. I listened for a long time, but there was nothing beyond the wind and the occasional thump of a branch against the roof. I tried to shake it off and lay back down. I drifted off eventually, but my sleep was thin and full of uneasy dreams. The next morning, I noticed something odd. Footprints around the back of the cabin near the pond. They were faint but clear prints in the wet, soft earth. Bare feet. No shoes, no boots. Just bare feet, small and narrow. I stood staring at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Maybe they were old, maybe a kid from the village messing about, but it didn't make sense. It was freezing out. Nobody would be barefoot now, not this far into the woods. Besides, the prints were sharp, like they were made recently. I went back inside, locked the door, and kept the fire going all day. I tried to read but couldn't focus. Every time the floor creaked or the wind rattled the windows, my head snapped around. I told myself I was being ridiculous. City brain, overreacting to country noises. That evening, just as the last light drained from the sky, I caught another glimpse, movement, again, between the trees. This time I was sure I saw her. A woman, standing just beyond the tree line, half hidden by the shadows. Pale skin, dark hair hanging limp around her face. She wasn't moving, just standing there watching. I froze, heart hammering. I didn't move for what felt like minutes. When I finally blinked, she was gone. Just the trees again. I told myself it was a trick of the light. Shadows playing games. My mind wound too tight. I didn't really believe it, though. That night, I dragged the heavy armchair against the front door and slept fitfully by the fire, my jacket still on, listening to every sound outside. The next morning, I seriously thought about leaving, packing up and driving straight back to Manchester. But a stubborn part of me, the same part that hated being pushed around by fear, told me to stay. I wasn't going to let some weird dreams and shadows scare me off. I decided to stay one more night, just one. I spent the day gathering more firewood, stacking it by the hearth. The woods felt heavier, like the trees were leaning in closer. I kept catching flashes of white between the trunks. A glimpse of her skin, maybe, or just the light. I didn't go far from the cabin. As dusk fell, I made sure everything was locked. Windows latched, curtains drawn. I lit every candle I found in the kitchen drawers, filling the room with warm light. I kept the fire roaring. Still, the feeling of being watched never went away. Around midnight, it started, the soft knock on the window. I froze, the book slipping from my hands. The knock came again, gentle, deliberate, not the random tap of a branch. A knock. I sat there, heart pounding in my chest, staring at the curtained window. I didn't move. Minutes passed. The knock didn't come again. But then I heard the footsteps. Soft, padding footsteps moving around the cabin, slow and patient. I strained to listen. The steps moved from window to window, circling. I didn't dare breathe. Then a scrape. Fingernails dragging slowly down the wood of the door. I wanted to grab my car keys and run, but I knew opening the door was the worst thing I could do. I stayed frozen in the armchair, gripping the arms so hard my fingers ached. The sounds eventually stopped. I sat there until the fire burned low, until the candles guttered out, until the first gray light of dawn crept into the room. When I finally stepped outside, the ground was muddy from rain in the night, and there, all around the cabin, were barefoot prints. Tiny, delicate prints circling, approaching the windows, the door, the porch, and far at the edge of the trees, standing completely still in the morning mist, was the woman. She didn't move, just watched. I didn't wait. I didn't pack properly. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and sprinted to the car, heart hammering so hard I could barely breathe. I slammed the door, locked it, and tore down the dirt track without even looking back. In the rearview mirror, just before the trees swallowed the cabin, I thought I saw her step out onto the porch, watching me leave. I didn't stop until I hit the motorway. Didn't stop until I was back in Manchester, locked inside my flat with all the lights on. I told Liam I had a great weekend. Thanks for the tip. I never told anyone else about what happened up there. Never went back. Sometimes late at night, I wonder if she's still there, in those woods, waiting for someone else to come. Or worse, maybe she's not waiting anymore. Maybe she's looking. But that's just my mind playing tricks, right? Still, I always double lock my doors now. Always. It was supposed to be a routine job. I'd been doing these maintenance tasks for years, so the idea of spending a few days alone in a remote cabin, fixing things up for a client, seemed like nothing out of the ordinary. The job was in the middle of nowhere, deep in the woods near Morrow's Ridge, about 30 miles outside of town. The cabin was tucked away off a narrow, poorly paved road, barely accessible without a four-wheel drive. Perfect for someone who wanted privacy. Maybe that's why the guy hired me. His name was Vincent Hale. He'd contacted me through a local contractors group, asking for repairs on an old cabin that had been in his family for years. The place hadn't seen much attention in a decade or so. The roof leaked, there were cracks in the walls, and the wiring was outdated. Simple stuff, but it meant I'd be staying there alone for a few days. I didn't mind. I'd been to a lot of remote places for work and never felt the slightest unease. Maybe that's why, on my first night at the cabin, I didn't think much of it when the sun dipped behind the trees, and I found myself alone with nothing but the sound of the wind and the occasional chirp of a bird. The cabin, though old and worn, had a solid feel to it. It creaked with the wind, but it was sturdy. I was comfortable, maybe too comfortable. By the second evening, I had the repairs underway, though the place was still a mess. The living room had dust in every corner, and the air smelled like stale wood. I hadn't bothered with much of a cleanup yet because I was focused on getting the rail work done, the roof, the plumbing, fixing the uneven floors. It was dark by the time I was wrapping up for the night, my tools scattered across the kitchen table. I went out to the porch for a breather, feeling the cold air bite at my face. I had no radio or phone signal, nothing but my own thoughts and the wind rustling through the trees. It felt quiet, almost too quiet, but that was just the isolation setting in. That's when I saw the lights. They came out of nowhere, 2 headlights, moving slowly through the forest. At first, I thought it might be a passing truck, someone lost. The road leading to the cabin was nearly invisible at night, so I wasn't sure how anyone would be able to find it. But the lights got closer, and I felt a little twinge of unease. The truck stopped at the edge of the clearing, its headlights cutting through the dark like twin searchlights. I squinted, trying to make out the figure behind the wheel. A man, dressed in a heavy jacket, leaned out of the truck window, his face obscured by the glare of the headlights. He didn't speak, didn't wave, just stared at me. I stood there for a moment, considering my options. This wasn't a place where strangers just happened to wander. Morrow's Ridge wasn't exactly a tourist spot. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice carrying across the distance. No response. After a few seconds, I turned back to the cabin, unsure if I should even bother with a conversation. The last thing I wanted was some random guy making a nuisance of himself. But then the truck moved forward. It didn't park or reverse. It just kept coming, creeping up toward the cabin. I froze, an uneasy feeling settling in my stomach. I hadn't expected anyone tonight, and I sure as hell didn't expect someone to be driving into my territory without so much as a hello. I watched as the truck slowed to a stop near the front door, the engine idling softly. The man's silhouette was still visible through the windshield. "Hey!" I called again, trying to shake the growing tension from my voice. "Who are you?" Finally, the truck door opened, and the figure stepped out. A tall man, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s. His clothes were worn, faded, as though he had been working out in the elements for a while. His hair was graying, and his face was rough. Sunken cheeks, deep lines around the eyes. A heavy work coat hung over his frame, and his boots were caked with mud. "I'm just passing through," he said. His voice was gruff, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in days. "Saw your light. Thought I'd stop and see if you needed help." "I'm good," I replied, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean, passing through? This place is off the beaten path." He chuckled darkly, his lips curling into a tight smile. "I know this land. Been around here for years. Didn't expect to see someone out here, though. Figured you might be lost." "Not lost," I said. "I'm just working on the cabin." "Ah, Vincent Hale's place," he said, nodding. "Knew the old man. Haven't seen this place in a long time. Not a lot of people come up here anymore." "Huh." His eyes studied me closely, scanning me from head to toe as if he were trying to figure me out. I felt a sudden prickling sensation down my back. Something about the way he was looking at me made me uncomfortable. "You're not a friend of Vincent's, are you?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my hand instinctively went to the door handle. I wasn't sure why, but I didn't want him getting any closer. He seemed to hesitate, then shook his head. "Nah, no friends of his. Just an old acquaintance. I've been out in these woods a lot longer than most. Thought I might offer some company for the night." I didn't buy it. There was something off about him, something unsettling in the way his smile never quite reached his eyes. "I'm fine. You should keep going," I said, taking a step back toward the door. His expression flickered for a moment, his face darkening. "You sure? It's a long way out of here, especially at night. Might be good to have someone nearby." I didn't wait for him to finish. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart racing. My instincts were screaming that I had made a mistake, letting him get so close, even talking to him. I stayed in the dark for a while, staring out through the cracks in the window blinds, waiting for the truck to drive away. Minutes passed. I didn't hear the engine start. Instead, I saw the truck lights from the corner of the window, dimmed but still there. He wasn't leaving. The fear that had been growing inside me shifted into full-on panic. I had no idea who this man was, and I didn't know what he wanted. Maybe he was just some lonely guy who lived in the woods, but there was something about him, his stillness, his silence, that felt wrong. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no signal. I hadn't expected it, but the sinking feeling that I was completely alone here started to hit hard. Time crawled. I don't know how long I sat there, my eyes glued to the small slit in the blinds, watching the truck, watching him. The world outside was dead quiet, the kind of silence you get when there's nothing for miles. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up with a jolt, disoriented. The truck was still there. The man was gone, but the truck hadn't moved. I was terrified. Something told me I wasn't safe. I had to do something, anything, but I couldn't think straight. The thought of running outside was enough to freeze me in place. I needed to check the perimeter of the cabin, but the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that something had already happened. The hours dragged on, and finally, at the first light of dawn, I felt brave enough to open the door. I cautiously stepped outside, heart hammering, looking around. The truck was still parked right outside the porch. And the man? He was nowhere to be seen. I was alone again, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I needed to get out of there, but I didn't dare leave yet. Not with his truck sitting there. Not with the feeling that I was being watched. The rest of the day went by without incident. I tried to keep myself busy with work, but I couldn't shake the paranoia. I kept expecting to see him appear from the woods. When evening came again, I made the decision to leave. I couldn't stay here, not with him out there. I packed up quickly, throwing my tools and personal items into the truck. I didn't even stop to check the cabin, just started the engine and drove, not looking back. As I left the clearing behind, I caught one final glimpse of the cabin. It looked so peaceful in the fading light, a peacefulness I knew was false. What I didn't know, though, was that I wasn't alone anymore. I never saw him again, not in town or anywhere else. But I still think about that man sometimes, how close he got, how I was this close to finding out what happened next. I don't work alone in cabins anymore. I hadn't planned on staying in that cabin for long. In fact, I wasn't supposed to be there at all. I'd taken a wrong turn during my road trip through the forests of Central Oregon, heading west toward the coast. The rain had started coming down hard just as the last of the daylight faded, leaving me with nowhere to go but the first place I could find, an old cabin tucked just off the dirt road. I wasn't exactly thrilled about it at first, but I figured I'd be okay. A night in an isolated cabin, out of the rain, wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. At the very least, I'd be out of the elements. I'd driven far enough to feel the pressure of fatigue creeping in, and the thought of setting up a tent in the downpour made me cringe. So, when I saw the cabin's silhouette through the trees, I decided to take a chance. I slowed my truck down, the tires spinning on the wet ground, before pulling up close to the cabin. It was small, one-story, with a slanted roof that had seen better days. The wood was weathered, stained with patches of moss and algae. Still, it looked sturdy enough, and the porch light was flickering weakly from the outside, so there was at least some sign of life. Maybe not recent, but it was there. I parked my truck by the cabin, rolled my sleeves up, and grabbed my backpack. The rain didn't show any signs of slowing down, and I figured I should move quickly before it became unbearable. I walked up to the door, the crunch of wet leaves underfoot the only sound breaking the heavy silence around me. The door was old, made of wood that looked like it hadn't been stained or treated in years, but it was solid. When I knocked, there was no response, but I figured no one was around. The door creaked open with a heavy groan, revealing a dark, dusty interior. The air smelled musty, thick with the scent of old wood and mildew. The faint glow of the porch light didn't do much to illuminate the inside, but I could make out the shape of a fireplace on one wall, with a small stack of wood beside it. The cabin seemed empty, untouched for years. I hesitated for a moment, but the sound of the rain against the roof was enough to push me inside. I closed the door behind me and set my backpack down on the wooden floor. The air inside was warmer than I expected, and I felt a sense of relief. It wasn't much, but it was better than being soaked and cold in the woods. I started a fire in the fireplace using a few sticks of wood from the stack. The crackling flames were a welcome sound, and the light from the fire flickered against the walls, casting strange, moving shadows across the room. I sat in front of the hearth, the warmth from the fire soaking into my skin, and for a moment, I almost forgot about the storm outside. The room was small, with old furniture scattered around. There was a worn-out couch by the wall, its cushions sunken and faded from years of use. A wooden dining table sat near the kitchen area, which was just a small space with a stove, a sink, and a few cupboards that seemed to be falling apart. Nothing about the place screamed luxury, but it had the essentials: a roof, some walls, and warmth. That was all I needed. As the hours passed, the storm outside only got worse. The rain beat against the cabin like it wanted to break through, and the wind howled in the trees. I was starting to feel tired, and the idea of getting some rest seemed more appealing by the minute. The fire was still crackling, but it was slowly dying down. I checked my phone to see if I had any service, but it had no signal. I wasn't worried about it. There wasn't much I needed to do other than wait out the storm. That's when I heard it. It was subtle at first, just a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere behind the walls. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself it was just the wind or maybe an animal outside, but it grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. It sounded like something or someone was trying to get inside. I stood up slowly, my heart rate increasing just a little. The scratching stopped for a moment, but then came a soft thud, followed by a series of odd knocks, as if something was tapping on the walls, moving along the edges of the room. My first thought was that it was probably just rodents. After all, this was an old cabin in the middle of nowhere. But the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic to be just an animal. I moved closer to the wall, pressing my ear against it, hoping to hear something more definite. Nothing. I stood there for a moment, listening intently. The only sound now was the storm outside and the faint crackle of the fire. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself. Could have been the house settling or something else. Something that wasn't worth worrying about. But then I heard it again. The sound of footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps on the porch outside. I froze. I wasn't imagining it this time. I could hear them clearly. Footsteps dragging through the wet dirt. The sound of a boot sinking into the mud. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. The steps were deliberate, measured, almost like they were waiting for something. My heart began to pound. I grabbed my backpack, quickly unzipped it, and pulled out the flashlight I kept in it. I flicked it on and aimed it toward the front door, which was still slightly ajar. There was no way I was going to leave it open. I needed to know if someone was out there. I slowly approached the door, the light from the fire dancing in the shadows, making everything feel strange and unsettling. As I reached for the door handle, I could hear the footsteps again, this time closer. I hesitated. Maybe it was just some lost traveler like myself, caught in the storm. But something about the deliberate pace made me uneasy. I opened the door slowly, peering outside. Nothing. The rain was coming down even harder now, and the wind whipped it sideways, making it hard to see anything clearly. But the porch was empty. No one was there. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, but the unease lingered. I stepped outside, the wet ground squelching beneath my boots, and shined the flashlight around. There was no sign of anyone near the cabin. The rain had washed away any tracks that might have been left. I was alone again. I closed the door and locked it behind me, my mind racing. The storm outside was fierce now, and the wind howled through the trees, making everything feel a little bit more alive. I felt like someone or something was watching me, though I couldn't say why. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, a weight on the back of my neck that refused to let up. Hours passed. I sat by the fire, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. I didn't hear any more footsteps, but the strange feeling remained, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I kept my backpack close, not knowing why. It was as if something inside me was warning me to be prepared. Just as I began to drift off, a loud crash startled me awake. The fire had died down to embers, casting only a faint glow in the room. I stood up quickly, panic rising in my chest. It came from the kitchen. I grabbed the flashlight again and made my way toward the source of the noise. My mind raced, but I couldn't think of any logical reason for it. Had something fallen off the counter? Or was there someone in the house? I shone the flashlight into the kitchen, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. The counters were bare, the sink empty. Then, I noticed something, an object on the floor near the doorway. A knife. It wasn't mine. I had no idea where it had come from, but the realization hit me hard. Someone had been in the cabin. They had been here, maybe even watching me while I sat by the fire. I felt sick to my stomach. I backed away slowly, my eyes scanning the room for anything else that seemed out of place. I couldn't explain what had happened or how it had gotten there, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone. I gathered my things and went for the door, my mind racing. I didn't care about the storm anymore. I didn't care about the rain or the cold. I needed to leave. Now, as I stepped outside, the howling wind and the sound of the rain enveloped me, but I didn't hesitate. I kept moving, not looking back. Hours later, I finally found my way back to the main road. The rain had begun to let up, but the air still felt thick with tension. I found a small town a few miles down the road, and after pulling into a gas station, I took a deep breath, grateful to be away from that cabin. It wasn't the storm that had scared me, it was what I hadn't seen, but I was sure of one thing. I wasn't ever going back there. It had been years since I'd last been back in this part of the country. Even now, driving along the narrow roads bordered by dense forests, my heart couldn't shake the tightness it felt. The old memories kept clawing their way to the surface, images I'd rather forget. But there I was, behind the wheel of my car, heading towards my ex-husband's cabin. The place where I had spent so much of my youth, a place that had been filled with laughter, love, and eventually grief. I hadn't even planned on stopping. But as I passed by the weathered wooden structure sitting lonely on the edge of the forest, I found myself turning the car down the familiar gravel driveway without a second thought. The cabin was smaller than I remembered. Time hadn't been kind to it. The roof sagged in places, and the wood had started to gray and split. It looked deserted, and I couldn't help but feel a cold shiver run down my spine as I parked in front of it. The cabin had once been our little haven, a place where we could escape from the world, from our families, from everything. But those days were long gone, buried in the past. I could still remember the first time I'd come here. I was 24, fresh out of college, eager to start my life with him. He had promised me that we'd build something together, something strong. But nothing lasts forever, and we had built this cabin together, brick by brick. Yet it was the foundation of our marriage that had eventually crumbled. When we split, I didn't come back. There was too much pain in the place, too much memory tied up in every nook and cranny. So the cabin had been left behind just like our marriage. I sat in the car for a while, staring at the structure. Part of me wanted to leave, to just drive away and never look back. But I couldn't. Something was pulling me closer, some unfinished business with the past that had to be settled. Finally, I gathered the courage to step out of the car. The air was thick with humidity from an earlier rain, and the woods surrounding the cabin were eerily quiet. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves as a breeze stirred them. I walked toward the front door, my steps crunching on the gravel beneath my boots. The door was still there, though the handle had long since rusted. I hesitated before turning it, but the door creaked open with ease, as if it had been waiting for me all this time. Inside, the air smelled stale, musty. The once cozy living room was now a shadow of what it had been. The furniture covered in dust, the fireplace cold and unused. Everything seemed frozen in time, as though the cabin had been waiting for me to return. The kitchen, once the heart of the home, was no better. Cabinets hung open, their shelves bare, save for a few old, forgotten dishes. A faint smell of mildew lingered in the corners. I ran my fingers over the counters, collecting dust that had settled here long ago. I didn't know what I expected to find, but it certainly wasn't this. I walked through each room slowly, touching things absent-mindedly, trying to remember the good times. But the memories, instead of bringing warmth, brought a chill. And then I found it. In the back room, the one we had turned into a small study, was an old, weathered box. It was tucked under the desk, hidden behind some forgotten papers. My heart skipped when I recognized it. It was the box where we had kept our shared dreams. Old photographs, travel brochures, plans for the future we'd never had. I knelt down and lifted the box, running my fingers over the delicate wood. I hadn't opened it since the divorce, and a part of me was reluctant now, as if doing so would reopen wounds I wasn't sure I could bear. But I couldn't stop myself. I opened it, and as I did, I was flooded with the memories we had tried to build here. And it hurt. It hurt more than I expected. But the thing that truly caught my attention was the letter. It was a note I had written to him just before the end. My handwriting was slanted, hurried, as if I had known that things were about to fall apart. I read it. It was short, just a few lines, but it hit me hard. It was a plea asking for one more chance to fix things. It was as if I had written it yesterday, the pain still so raw, so real. I hadn't expected to find this here, but somehow, in this cabin, this broken space filled with remnants of the past, I found it. I sat on the floor for a long time after that, lost in thought. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the room. As the daylight waned, the cabin seemed to grow darker, colder, and that's when I started to feel it. It wasn't just the cold air that made me uneasy. It was the overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood up quickly, dropping the letter back into the box. I scanned the room. No one, but the feeling lingered, creeping along my skin like a cold hand brushing against my neck. I stepped back into the main room, my eyes darting from one corner to another. The silence was oppressive, and I realized I was holding my breath. That's when I heard it. A soft thud. It came from upstairs, where the bedrooms were. My heart thudded in my chest as I froze. It wasn't the wind. The house was still. Too still. I felt a surge of panic. I told myself it was just an animal. Maybe a raccoon or some other creature that had wandered inside over the years. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and slowly made my way up the stairs. The steps creaked beneath my feet, echoing in the silence. Each step felt heavier than the last. When I reached the top of the stairs, I hesitated. The hallway stretched in front of me, dark and empty. And then the thud came again. I moved toward the bedroom at the end of the hall, the one we had shared. The door was ajar, just a crack, and I could see the faint outline of furniture inside. The window was cracked open, letting in a sliver of moonlight. I pushed the door open, and my breath caught. There, sitting on the edge of the bed, was a figure. Person. They were facing away from me, but I could tell they weren't moving. They were still, perfectly still. My heart raced in my chest, and I stepped back, my hand shaking as I gripped the flashlight. But before I could turn and run, the figure turned its head slowly. It wasn't my ex-husband. I froze, a jolt of terror running through me. The figure's eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. They didn't move, didn't speak, but something about the way they stared made my skin crawl. Couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't even look away. Then, without warning, the figure stood up and walked toward me, its footsteps quiet on the old wooden floor. In a panic, I turned and ran, stumbling down the stairs, my mind racing. I reached the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't open. It felt like the air had thickened, pressing down on me, trapping me inside. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I managed to break free. The door slammed open, and I ran out into the yard, the cool night air filling my lungs. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached my car, and even then, I could still feel the eyes on me, burning into my back. But when I finally started the engine and looked into the rearview mirror, there was nothing behind me. No one. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, had been watching me. I left the cabin that night and never returned. I never found out who or what it was in there, but I don't need to know. Some things are better left in the past where they belong. And as I drove away, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was inside that cabin, it wasn't the past I had left behind. It was something much darker, and I was never going back to find out. It was the fall of 2017 when I decided to take a trip out to my uncle's old hunting cabin in western Montana. My name's Ryan Bishop. I was 32 then, living in Billings, working construction jobs, mostly roofing and framing. Life had been pretty loud for a while, between the work, the city, and everything else that piles up without you noticing. I needed quiet, real quiet, the kind you can only get when you're miles and miles away from anything that hums or beeps or buzzes. The cabin wasn't much, just 4 wooden walls, a tin roof that rattled when the wind kicked up, and an old wood stove that creaked and snapped through the night. It sat in the middle of a thicket of pines and scrub oak, about an hour's drive from the nearest dirt road, and even getting there meant taking a battered old trail that barely deserved the name. I had a beat-up Ford Bronco that could handle it, and that morning, the truck bed was loaded down with everything I thought I'd need for a week. Canned food, water, some old hunting gear, a cot, extra blankets, a few guns, and a lot of ammunition. It had rained earlier that week, and the trail was thick with mud. Tires spun and slid, and the Bronco groaned in protest. Branches scraped against the sides of the truck like fingernails. For the last mile, I ended up parking and walking the rest of the way in. The air smelled wet and clean, heavy with pine. Every footstep squelched in the mud, and my boots picked up half the forest by the time I got to the front door. The cabin looked the same as it always had, maybe a little more run down. The windows were grimy, the boards warped with rain and time. A pile of chopped wood leaned haphazardly against the side, still there from the last time someone had stayed, which must have been months ago. I got the door open with some effort. The wood had swollen in its frame and dropped my pack inside. The first thing I noticed once I got the fire going and the place warmed up a bit was the silence. Not city silence, not just an absence of noise. Real silence, like the trees and the dirt and the rocks were holding their breath. It was unsettling at first. My ears kept searching for something familiar, a car horn or a distant lawnmower, but there was nothing, just my own breathing and the pop of the fire. The first night went fine. I cooked a can of stew on the stove, drank a couple of warm beers, and stretched out on the cot with a thick old sleeping bag wrapped around me. I had a rifle leaned up against the wall within arm's reach, more out of habit than anything. I drifted off fast, the way you only can when you're bone tired. Somewhere around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up, not because of a sound, but because of the lack of it. Even the fire had gone out, and the cabin had gone pitch black and cold. I lay there listening. There was a feeling you get sometimes, like the air shifts around you, heavy and wrong, and you can't explain why. That feeling was thick enough to choke on. After a while, I heard something, not from inside, but outside near the woods. A soft, slow crunch, like someone stepping carefully over the wet leaves and broken branches. I told myself it was just a deer, maybe an elk. They came close sometimes, drawn by the leftover salt lick out by the back of the cabin. Still, I sat up and listened harder. The footsteps were slow, measured, not the quick, nervous movements of an animal. Whoever it was, and I was sure now it was a person, they were moving like they didn't want to be heard. I waited for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a few minutes. Eventually, the steps faded off, swallowed by the forest. I didn't sleep much after that. I sat with the rifle across my knees until the first gray light started filtering through the trees. The next morning, I found tracks about 50 yards from the cabin. Boot prints, big ones, way bigger than mine. Whoever it was, they had circled the cabin in the mud, stopping now and then like they were looking at it, studying it. There were no tire tracks, no horse tracks, nothing to explain how they'd gotten there. I told myself it could have been a hunter, someone lost, maybe looking for a landmark. People did stupid things out in the woods all the time. Still, my gut was tight. I loaded up the rifle, made sure the pistol on my hip was ready, and set about my day. I hunted for a few hours, mostly just wandering the woods, pretending like everything was normal. The whole time, though, I kept feeling watched. Not the vague, silly kind of feeling you get when you're alone, but something sharper, heavier, almost physical. Every now and then I'd stop and listen, but there was nothing but the wind moving through the pines. By late afternoon, the sky started to darken with heavy clouds, and I headed back to the cabin. I locked the door, bolted it from the inside, and pulled the heavy old dresser in front of it too, just for good measure. I lit the lamps, got a good fire going, cooked a meal, and tried to shake it off. That night it rained. A heavy, soaking rain that drummed on the roof and splashed down in thick sheets from the eaves. I sat up late, staring at the fire, sipping from a bottle of whiskey I'd brought along. The rain made it hard to hear anything outside, and part of me was glad for that. I figured whoever it was probably wasn't stupid enough to be wandering the woods in that weather anyway. When I finally crawled into the cot, I passed out hard. Dead sleep. The kind where you wake up and you have no idea where you are for a few seconds. It was almost dawn when I woke up, heart pounding. It wasn't a sound this time that woke me. It was a feeling again. Heavy, pressing. I sat up slowly and listened. Something was inside the cabin. The fire had burned down to red coals, casting just enough light to see vague shapes. I didn't move, barely breathed. I scanned the room, every inch of it. There, near the window, I saw it. A shape, human, tall, standing completely still, facing me. For a long moment, we both just sat there. Me frozen in my bed, it standing by the window, the rain still hammering outside. I don't know how long it lasted. Could have been seconds, could have been minutes. Finally, I moved. Slow, careful, I slid my hand under the cot where the rifle was leaning. The second I touched it, the shape moved too. Fast, too fast. It bolted for the door. The dresser slammed against the frame as whoever it was shoved hard. The cabin shook. I racked around into the chamber, aimed at the door and waited. But nothing else happened. No more pounding. No sounds at all except the rain. When the sun finally dragged itself over the horizon, I unbolted the door and eased it open. Whoever it was, they were gone. The tracks in the mud told the story. They had come right up to the window, stood there, watching me, then tried to break in when they thought I was asleep. When I moved, they ran. The weirdest part was the other tracks. The ones leading away from the cabin didn't head for the trail or the woods. They led deeper into the thickest part of the forest, the part where the trees grew so close together you could barely push through. I didn't waste time. I packed my gear in record speed, slinging it into the Bronco and tearing down that trail so fast I almost lost a wheel in the mud. When I got back to Billings, I told a few friends. They laughed it off, said it was probably just some backwoods weirdo, maybe a meth head or a hunter who got lost and freaked out. But something about it stuck with me. The way the shape stood so still, the way the tracks moved, not away from danger, but into it like they were going home. I never went back to that cabin, left it to rot out there in the woods. A few months later, I heard a story on the news about a missing hiker, gone without a trace from somewhere near that area. They never found him. Just a torn up backpack and some boot prints that led into the woods and then just stopped. People said it was bears, mountain lions, bad luck. But I know better. There's something out there, deep in the woods, where the trees grow too close and the sun barely touches the ground. Something that watches, something that waits. I don't go hunting anymore. Not alone, not out there. Some places aren't meant for people. Some places never were. It was 2012 when I decided I needed to get away for a while. I was living in a small apartment in Spokane, Washington back then, working a construction job that just kept dragging me into the ground. Long days, short nights, and a constant ache in my back that made me feel 20 years older than I was. I was only 32, but you wouldn't have guessed it by the way I moved after a shift. I had saved up a little money, not much, just enough to take a week off and head out somewhere nobody could find me. A friend of mine, Tim, told me about this old hunting cabin his uncle used to own out near Priest Lake, Idaho. It was abandoned now, he said, but still standing. No electricity, no running water, but it was solid enough to sleep in if you didn't mind roughing it. That sounded perfect to me. I didn't need comfort. I needed space. I needed quiet. I needed to feel like I was the last man on earth for a little while. I packed light, a backpack stuffed with a couple changes of clothes, some canned food, a camp stove, a first aid kit, a hunting knife, a flashlight with extra batteries, and my old .22 rifle. I wasn't planning on hunting, but being out there alone, I figured it was smart to have something just in case. The drive took most of the day. The roads got worse the deeper I got into the woods, and eventually I had to leave my truck on the side of a narrow dirt path and hike the rest of the way in. By the time I found the cabin, the sun was low and bleeding through the trees like melted gold. It wasn't much to look at, just 4 walls of weather-beaten wood and a sagging tin roof, but it was standing. That was enough. I circled it once, checking for any big holes or signs of animals nesting inside. There were a few old claw marks around the door frame, probably from a bear years ago, but otherwise it looked all right. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and the air inside smelled like damp wood and old ashes. There was a fireplace built into one wall, a rusted metal bed frame without a mattress, and a rickety wooden chair tipped over in the corner. I set my pack down and stretched my legs, feeling the deep pull of exhaustion in my bones. The hike had taken longer than I thought, and my body wasn't used to this kind of effort anymore. That night, I built a small fire in the old fireplace and ate a can of beans straight out of the tin. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, staring into the flames. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, making the kind of low, whispering sound that never quite settles. Every now and then, I thought I heard something heavier than the wind. A branch snapping, maybe, or footsteps in the undergrowth. But it was probably just the woods settling in for the night. That's what I told myself, anyway. When the fire burned down low, I curled up in my sleeping bag and tried to sleep. The hard floor made my hips ache, and every noise outside seemed magnified in the dark. But eventually, exhaustion won out. The next morning, I woke up stiff and cold. The fire had gone out hours ago, and the cabin felt like a freezer. I stepped outside to stretch and take a leak, and that's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl a little. There were tracks in the dirt around the cabin. Not animal tracks, bootprints. They circled the cabin once, then disappeared into the woods. I stood there for a long minute, just staring at them. They weren't mine, they were too big, too deep. Someone else had been here, recently, maybe even while I was sleeping. I told myself it could have been a hunter passing through, or maybe some kids screwing around. But the prints looked deliberate, careful, like whoever made them wasn't just passing by. They were checking the place out. I kept my rifle close after that. I didn't plan on using it, but having it in my hands made me feel a little steadier. The days passed slowly. I spent my time gathering firewood, boiling water from a nearby stream to drink, and sitting on the rickety porch, watching the trees sway in the breeze. I didn't see anyone else. No hikers, no campers. Just deer now and then, and once a black bear way off in the distance. But at night, it was different. At night, the woods felt alive. I kept hearing things. Soft thuds, the crack of twigs, breathing that didn't seem like it belonged to any animal I knew. I started sleeping with one eye open, the rifle resting across my lap. One night, just after I'd put the fire out and was settling into my sleeping bag, I heard something outside. It wasn't just a noise this time, it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate crunching in the leaves. They moved around the cabin, pausing every few steps. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I sat up, gripping the rifle tight. I didn't dare make a sound. The footsteps got closer to the door. Then they stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. Minutes dragged by. Finally, the footsteps moved away, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there in the dark, listening, the barrel of the rifle resting against my knee. The next morning, I found something hanging on the door, a small bundle of sticks tied together with what looked like fishing line. It wasn't there the night before. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it, feeling something cold crawl up my spine. It wasn't a prank. It didn't feel like a joke. Felt like a warning. I spent the day on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every sound made me jump. I thought about packing up and hiking back to my truck, but part of me was too stubborn to leave. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I could handle it. That night, I built the fire up bigger than usual and sat right in front of it, my rifle close. I kept my flashlight handy too. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time they were heavier, closer. Whoever it was wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. I sat frozen, staring at the door. The footsteps stopped right outside. Then something brushed against the wood. A slow, dragging sound, like fingers trailing across the surface. I raised the rifle, my hands shaking. Whoever was out there didn't try to open the door. They just stood there, waiting. Minutes crawled by. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Finally, the footsteps retreated. I waited until the sounds faded completely before I dared move. I didn't sleep at all that night. At first light, I packed up my gear and left. I didn't bother cleaning up. I just stuffed everything into my backpack, slung the rifle over my shoulder, and got the hell out of there. The hike back to the truck felt twice as long. Every rustle in the underbrush made me whip around, expecting to see someone or something following me. But I didn't see anyone. When I reached my truck, I found something sitting on the hood, another bundle of sticks, tied together with the same fishing line. My stomach twisted into a knot. I scanned the woods, but saw nothing. I didn't waste any more time. I threw my pack into the truck, started the engine, and peeled out of there, tires spinning on the dirt road. I didn't stop until I was back in Spokane. For days after, I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. I barely slept. Every noise outside my apartment made me jump. Eventually, the fear faded, but it never really left. I never went back to that cabin, never even thought about it. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. Maybe it was just some backwoods lunatic playing games. Maybe it was something worse. All I know is the woods aren't as empty as they look. And when you're out there, alone, you're never really alone. I learned that the hard way, and I never went looking for solitude again. It was the kind of night where the wind howled like it was trying to tell me something. The branches outside my grandmother's cabin creaked and groaned as though the woods themselves were speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I had always loved the cabin growing up. It was an old, creaky place built by my grandfather many years ago. It sat nestled in the woods, a few miles from the nearest town, so isolated that I'd forgotten what city noise sounded like. In the past, it had been a place of warmth, laughter, and family. But tonight, something felt different. I had come back alone. My parents had passed a few years ago, and my grandma, who had lived in the cabin her whole life, was now gone too. The house stood empty, just like it had for months. I decided it was time to clean it up a bit, maybe fix a few things and spend the night there. It seemed like the right thing to do, return to the place that had been such an integral part of my childhood. The weather had turned just as I arrived, rain pouring down in sheets, hitting the roof with such intensity that it drowned out any other noise. I had parked my car a little ways down the trail, as the road was too narrow to get too close. The forest around me was thick and uninviting, especially at night. The trees stretched up into the darkness, their twisted branches almost like skeletal hands reaching out. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and the faint trace of dust. It was a familiar scent, the kind that brought memories rushing back. I made my way to the kitchen first, where I grabbed a flashlight and started rummaging through the cupboards. I wasn't expecting much, just checking to see what was left behind, maybe find a spare light bulb or something useful. I moved from room to room, silently noting the things that had been left behind. There were old photographs on the mantel, my grandmother's faded quilt draped across the couch, and even some of her books on the shelves. It almost felt like she'd just stepped out for a moment and would be back soon. But I knew better. She wouldn't be coming back. The wind had picked up, and I noticed how it howled through the cracks in the cabin's old wooden walls. I set the flashlight down on the kitchen counter and sat down at the table for a moment to collect my thoughts. It was still early evening, but the rain and the relentless wind made the daylight seem like it had already faded hours ago. I figured I'd light the fireplace, make a cup of tea, and just sit and relax for a bit. I had always thought there was something a bit unsettling about the cabin, though maybe it was just my imagination. But as a kid, I had always felt that the woods surrounding the cabin had an air of mystery. My grandma had never seemed scared, but I remember her telling me stories of strange noises at night. Branches snapping when no one was outside, footsteps crunching in the snow when she was alone in the house. I had always dismissed them, thinking they were just her way of scaring me into being cautious in the woods. But tonight, alone in the cabin, those old stories felt less like nonsense and more like warnings. I decided to keep my mind busy by starting a fire in the fireplace. I hadn't done it in years, but I remembered how my grandma would carefully arrange the logs, making sure they were just right to catch the flame. I followed her method as best as I could, and after a few attempts, I finally saw the flicker of flames, the soft crackling filling the silence. With the fire now blazing, I sat back in my chair, letting the warmth spread through the room. But as I settled in, something caught my attention, the sound of something moving outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it was more deliberate, a sound that came from somewhere just beyond the cabin's windows. I stood up, cautious but curious. I walked over to the window and peered out. It was hard to see through the rain, but I thought I saw something move in the trees. A figure, just at the edge of my vision. My heart rate quickened, and I stepped back from the window, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal or just the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. But then the sound came again, a soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps, the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, walking through the underbrush. I froze. No one knew I was here. There was no reason for anyone to be out in these woods, especially at night in such bad weather. I grabbed the flashlight from the table, and I carefully opened the door. The cold air hit me like a slap to the face, but I stepped outside anyway, trying to steady my breathing. The woods seemed alive with sound, the rustle of leaves, the creak of trees, the patter of rain against the ground. But there was no sign of the figure. I stood for a few moments, scanning the shadows. My eyes strained against the darkness, but I could see nothing. I started to walk further into the woods, trying to make sense of the noises, but the further I went, the more unsettling everything became. The trees felt denser, the air heavier. I had no idea how far I had walked or how much time had passed, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. Something wasn't right. It wasn't just the isolation of the cabin or the wind playing tricks on my mind. It was something else. Then, in the distance, I saw it. A flash of movement, quick, deliberate. It was the figure again. This time, I was sure of it. Someone or something was out here and they were watching me. I stopped dead in my tracks, suddenly aware of how vulnerable I was. I had no weapon, no way to defend myself. I turned to head back to the cabin, but the sound of footsteps behind me made my blood run cold. Someone was following me. I didn't dare turn around. Instead, I picked up the pace, nearly running now, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't see the figure anymore, but I could hear them getting closer, the sound of their footsteps cutting through the underbrush. Just as I was about to reach the cabin, I heard a voice, a soft, almost inaudible whisper, as if someone was speaking directly into my ear. The voice wasn't familiar, and it wasn't like anything I had ever heard. It wasn't friendly, but it wasn't threatening either. It was just there. "Not alone," the voice whispered. I didn't look back. I burst into the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it with trembling hands. My pulse was racing. I felt as if I had just escaped something, but I couldn't explain why. The voice, the figure, everything felt wrong, but I had no explanation. I sat by the fire for hours, too scared to even sleep. I didn't dare go back outside. Every sound, every creak, every whisper from the wind made my skin crawl. But eventually, the night passed, and the morning light began to creep in through the cracks in the walls. The footsteps, the voice, they were gone. Everything was quiet again. The storm had stopped, and the woods seemed peaceful, like nothing had ever happened. I didn't stay much longer. By midday, I packed up my things and left the cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I drove back to town, the cabin disappearing behind me as I left the woods behind. But even now, whenever I think back to that night, I can't shake the feeling that the woods are still watching, waiting for someone else to wander in, just like I did. It was September 2004 when I decided to build a small cabin out by the woods near Lockhart, Texas. I was 29 years old back then, working odd construction jobs that didn't really keep me busy enough, and I guess I just wanted a project for myself. Something real, something I could say I built with my own two hands. I had no real plan drawn up, just a rough idea sketched on a crumpled piece of paper. A cabin no bigger than a large shed, for walls, a pitched roof, a little porch if I could get to it. No electricity, no running water, just something simple. I picked a spot a few miles out from town, right along a muddy old path that barely counted as a road anymore. Nobody came out this far. I figured I wouldn't be bothering anybody, and nobody would bother me. The land was part of some forgotten property line from a family I barely knew, and they gave me their blessing to use it, since they didn't do anything with it anyway. It was all thick oaks, tall dry grass, and stones underfoot, and when it rained, the whole place smelled like fresh earth and rotting wood. The first few days were dry, hot, and miserable. I worked by myself, loading beams of cheap pine I had bought secondhand into my old pickup and hauling them out to the spot. I brought basic tools, a handsaw, hammer, nails, a level, measuring tape. No power tools, just the old-fashioned way. The sun beat down on me every day, and by the time the frame started going up, I was already thinking this might have been a dumb idea. By the fifth day, the frame stood up tall, for solid walls outlined by simple beams. I had just started working on getting the roof joists in place when the sky changed. Texas weather doesn't give you a lot of warning. One minute it's clear, and the next it feels like the world is about to tear open. I remember hearing the wind first, a low moaning through the trees. The air turned cool and sticky, and the clouds dropped so low it looked like you could reach up and touch them. I had checked the weather before coming out, and they said chance of rain, but it felt heavier than that. I should have packed up and headed back to town right then, but I was stubborn. I told myself I'd just get a little more done. Maybe nail down the temporary rafters, put up a tarp, something quick. I figured even if it rained, it'd blow through fast. By the time I realized how wrong I was, it was too late. The first fat drops of rain hit the dirt while I was balancing a joist on my shoulder, trying to line it up. The ground sucked at my boots with every step. The frame of the cabin creaked and groaned as the wind shoved against it. I had thrown a thick plastic tarp over the half-finished roof, pinning it down with rocks and boards, but it was no match for the weather that was coming. Within half an hour, it wasn't just raining. It was pouring so hard you couldn't see past 10 feet. I was soaked through. The world around me blurred into a gray sheet, and the mud grabbed at my boots so bad I nearly lost one. The pickup was about 50 yards down the path, but it might as well have been a mile. I knew if I ran for it, I'd slip and fall, maybe worse, so I decided to hunker down inside the half-built cabin. It wasn't much, just the skeleton of a building. No doors, no real roof, gaps between the wall planks where the wind howled through. I sat down on an overturned bucket, pulled my jacket tighter around me, and listened to the storm rage. The rain didn't let up. Hours passed. The sky turned darker, not lighter, like the sun had given up. I had my watch on, but the numbers blurred in the dim light. I guessed it was close to 6 or 7 in the evening. It would get dark soon, and then I'd really be stuck. I kept myself busy at first, pacing the small floor, checking the tarp overhead to make sure it wasn't pooling with too much water, shoving loose boards against the gaps where the rain blew sideways through the walls. It helped a little, but not much. Time crawled. Every little creak of the wooden frame made my heart jump. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps outside. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but it didn't help much. The feeling I had, it wasn't panic exactly, but close. Like something just wasn't right. Something off. At some point, I spotted a movement through the gaps in the wall. A dark shape. My first thought was that someone else had gotten caught in the storm. Maybe a hunter or a lost hiker. I stood up, heart hammering, peering out into the rain. But when I blinked, there was nothing there but trees and gray mist. I sat back down, trying to calm myself. I was cold now, shivering in my wet clothes. My boots were caked in mud. I wished I'd brought a better jacket or at least a damn flashlight. The rain didn't stop. It got worse. Around 9 or 10 that night, the wind picked up to a shrieking howl. It slammed against the frame of the cabin, making the beams groan and rattle. The tarp flapped violently, tearing loose at one corner. Water sprayed through the open roof, drenching me even more. I thought about making a run for the truck again, but it was no good. In that mess, in the dark, I'd never find the path. Instead, I tried to make the best of it. I pulled a few spare boards into a rough corner, stacked them up like a crude wall to block the worst of the rain. Then I curled up against them, arms wrapped around my knees, jacket pulled over my head. It was a long night. I dozed a little but kept waking at every sound. The rain hitting the tarp, a crack of a tree branch snapping in the woods, the distant roar of wind. My body ached from the cold, my fingers numb. Sometime after midnight, I heard something else. Footsteps, clear, slow, squelching footsteps in the mud, just outside the wall. I froze, held my breath. The steps moved along the side of the cabin, soft at first, then heavier. I could almost picture someone circling the frame, slow and careful, like they were looking for a way in. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. For a few awful minutes, I just sat there, listening to the wet sounds of someone moving around the cabin. Then, nothing. Silence except for the rain. I waited for what felt like forever before I dared to move. I crawled slowly across the floor to a gap in the wall and peered out. Nothing, just rain and darkness. I sat back down, heart still pounding so hard it hurt. Maybe it was an animal, I told myself. A deer or a wild pig. They come out in storms sometimes, confused, looking for shelter. Maybe, but I didn't believe it. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too afraid to close my eyes. I just sat there in the cold, counting the minutes, waiting for the sky to lighten. Eventually, it did. Morning crept in slow and gray, barely brighter than the night before. The rain was still falling, but softer now. A cold drizzle. I waited until I could see well enough, then got up and stumbled outside. The mud was deep, almost to my ankles. My truck was still there, half sunken in the muck. I looked around the cabin site, scanning the ground. And there they were, footprints, clear as anything. Big, heavy prints leading up from the woods, circling the cabin, then back into the trees. Not animal prints, boots, human boots, deep enough to tell they were fresh from last night. Someone had been out there walking around the cabin while I sat inside hiding. I didn't waste any more time. I sloshed my way to the truck, yanked open the door, and climbed in. The engine coughed once, twice, then started up. I slammed it into gear and tore out of there, the tires spinning in the mud. I didn't go back for 2 weeks. When I finally did, the cabin was just like I left it. No signs anyone had been there. No footprints, no broken boards. Just my half-finished project standing lonely in the clearing. I kept working on it after that, but I was never comfortable out there again. Every time the wind picked up, or a twig snapped in the woods, I jumped. I kept a heavy wrench close by just in case. I finished the cabin about 2 months later. It wasn't much to look at. Rough walls, leaky roof, a sagging little porch, but it was mine. I stayed a few nights here and there, camping out with a sleeping bag and a lantern. But I never stayed when it rained. And I never forgot that night, sitting soaked and shivering in the dark, listening to someone I couldn't see walking slow circles around the walls I'd built. The cabin's still there, far as I know. I don't visit much anymore. Too many memories. These days I live in a small house closer to town, where the rain just means wet roads and muddy boots, not long nights and things moving unseen through the trees. Looking back, I think about who or what was out there that night. Some lost soul caught in the storm, maybe. Some drifter looking for shelter. Or something worse, someone who meant harm, but decided against it for reasons I'll never know. Either way, I was lucky. Lucky to have made it through that night with nothing worse than a story to tell. Lucky that whoever was out there didn't decide to come through those half-built walls after all. And maybe that's all building that cabin ever really taught me. Out there, alone in the wild, you realize just how thin the walls are between you and everything else. Just a few boards, a tarp, and a little hope holding back the dark. The rain had been coming down steadily for hours, and the night had sunk deep into the woods. I was alone, a man in his early 30s, trying to unwind after a hectic year of work. The cabin was small, tucked away in a dense patch of trees in the middle of nowhere. My friend Jason had suggested this cabin for a quiet weekend away from the chaos of daily life. Jason and I had been friends since high school, and after he mentioned this cabin in a remote area, I thought it would be perfect. A couple of days in solitude, disconnected from everything. Jason wasn't with me this time. Something had come up on his end, and he couldn't make it. I didn't mind. The idea of being in a quiet, isolated cabin was still appealing. I figured the solitude would be refreshing, especially with the constant noise of my job and the stress that had been mounting. The cabin itself was old, likely built in the early 1900s, with walls that creaked whenever a gust of wind blew through the trees. But it was cozy, with a fireplace that crackled and warmed the space, an old wood stove for cooking, and a small but functional kitchen. The rain hit the roof with a rhythmic patter, almost like a lullaby. I was curled up in the living room, a hot cup of coffee in my hand, staring at the dancing flames in the fireplace. The world outside felt distant, a dark, quiet world that seemed to be held at bay by the sturdy cabin walls. As the night wore on, I started to feel a bit of unease. It wasn't anything specific, just a nagging feeling, like being watched. I dismissed it. The wind howled louder now, rattling the windows in their frames, but still, nothing seemed out of place. The feeling grew, though. It wasn't just the wind or the rain. It was as if there was something wrong. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I turned off the lights, deciding to head to bed. I had been up for most of the day, and the exhaustion was starting to catch up with me. The old bed creaked as I climbed into it, and the woolen blanket smelled faintly of cedar, the kind of smell that made the cabin feel like it belonged to a different era, one that didn't know the comforts of modern life. The fire in the living room had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. Just as I started to drift off, I heard something, a sound from outside. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the rain, but it was there, a faint scratching noise. It sounded like something scraping against the wood. I sat up, my heart rate quickening. The wind had picked up again, howling outside, so it could have just been that. But the more I listened, the more distinct it became. I pushed the blankets off and got out of bed, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. My breath was steady, but my senses were alert. I couldn't see anything from the bedroom window, but the sound was unmistakable. It wasn't the wind. Someone or something was out there. I grabbed the flashlight from the table beside the door, clicked it on, and slowly made my way toward the front door. I stopped just short of it and stood still, listening intently. The sound was louder now, almost rhythmic, like someone was pacing back and forth just outside. My first thought was a raccoon or maybe a deer, something small, harmless, just drawn to the cabin in the night. But then the scraping sound stopped. Complete silence. I waited, my hand gripping the flashlight, ready to open the door if needed. Another minute passed. Then there was a sharp knock. It was loud, deliberate. I froze. My mind raced, trying to piece together what I had heard. A knock? Who would be out here in this storm at this hour? And why would they knock? I didn't know anyone nearby, not for miles. The nearest neighbor, if you could call them that, was over a half-hour drive away. I swallowed hard, wondering if I should open the door. I stepped back, unsure of what to do. Then, just as I was about to turn away, the knock came again, louder, more forceful this time. I jumped, my heart skipping a beat. Without thinking, I moved to the window, shining the flashlight out into the yard. The beam cut through the rain, illuminating the surrounding trees, but nothing was there. The darkness seemed endless. I returned to the door, my mind swirling with possibilities. I knew it couldn't be Jason. He wasn't due until tomorrow, and this wasn't like him to knock this way. I hadn't heard a car pull up either, which would have been hard to miss in this downpour. I stood there for several more minutes, trying to collect my thoughts, my pulse racing. The knock hadn't come again, but the silence was just as unsettling. I decided to check the outside. Whatever this was, I needed to know. I grabbed a jacket from the coat rack and slipped it on, taking a deep breath before opening the door. The rain hit me instantly, cold and biting. I looked around the cabin, squinting against the downpour. The yard was empty, not even the slightest movement in the trees. The wet earth sucked at my boots as I moved out onto the porch, my flashlight cutting through the night. No one. The feeling of unease hadn't left, though. It lingered like a thick fog. I couldn't shake the thought that something or someone was out there, watching. I didn't want to be outside any longer. I quickly stepped back inside and shut the door behind me. My pulse slowed, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I bolted the door and locked it, taking a deep breath as I leaned against the wall. I was being ridiculous, I thought. It's just the isolation getting to me. But as I turned back to the living room, I noticed something strange. The fire was burning again. I was sure I had left it to die down to a few embers before heading to bed. But now, the flames were high again, flickering in the hearth. A chill ran through me. I approached the fire cautiously, my mind racing for an explanation. Maybe the wind had knocked something over, stirring the flames back to life. But nothing was out of place. The logs were neatly arranged, as they had been before. The only thing I noticed was a small, black object lying on the floor near the fire. I bent down to pick it up, and my stomach churned. It was a stone, a smooth, rounded stone, the kind you'd find along a riverbank. It didn't belong here. I couldn't remember seeing it before. I didn't recall anything like it being around when I first arrived. Had someone placed it there? The thought sent a wave of dread through me. I checked the windows again, but there was no sign of anyone outside. I dropped the stone onto the table and went back to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened in the last hour. The knock, the scratching, the stone. I couldn't stop thinking about it. As the rain continued to batter the cabin, I stayed awake, listening intently for any sound, anything that might explain what was going on. But the night passed in eerie silence. I didn't sleep a wink. The next morning, when the first light of day filtered through the trees, I quickly packed up my things. I wasn't taking any chances. There was something wrong about this place, something I couldn't explain. As I loaded my bags into the car, I glanced back at the cabin. The door, which had been locked and bolted, was wide open. I never went back to that cabin. It was supposed to be just another quiet job, a standard repair that would take no more than a few hours. My boss, Dave, called me up early on a Friday morning to ask if I could head out to the cabin in the woods. The place was isolated, and though I didn't mind the solitude, something about the request felt off. He mentioned that the cabin needed some work on the furniture, and he'd promised me a good bonus if I could get it done quickly. Money's money, and the idea of extra cash was enough to push aside any lingering doubts I might have had. Dave owned a small furniture business, and as the lead mechanic, I was the one who took on the big repairs. The cabin itself was something he'd inherited years ago and never bothered to fix up. It wasn't in the best shape, but it was one of those places that seemed to have a kind of charm about it, despite its weathered appearance. The cabin wasn't far from where we worked, about an hour's drive out into the forest, a remote area far enough to feel disconnected from the world, but close enough that you knew someone could hear you scream if necessary. I grabbed my toolbox, threw it in the back of my truck, and set off without thinking too much about it. I didn't even bother telling anyone where I was going. Just a habit of mine. I like to work alone. The drive out to the cabin was smooth for the first 30 minutes, but as I turned onto the gravel road leading to the property, things started to feel different. The woods grew denser, the trees more twisted and dark. The sun was covered by thick clouds, casting a gray pall over the entire landscape. It wasn't raining, but the air was heavy, like it was about to. The cabin came into view after a few more miles. It wasn't much to look at, small, 2 stories with a porch that sagged to one side. The wood was cracked and faded, but it looked like it had held up well over the years. There was a faint smell of pine and wet earth, but it wasn't unpleasant. I parked the truck, grabbed my tools, and approached the front door. It was locked. I tried the knob, but it wouldn't budge, so I knocked. There was no answer. I wasn't surprised. Dave had mentioned the cabin was rarely used, and I assumed he was out running errands or something. I pulled out my phone to check the time, 2:30 p.m. I'd planned on being back by evening, but something about the place didn't sit right with me. I could feel the silence pressing in. The birds weren't singing, no wind rustled the trees, and there was a sense of stillness that seemed unnatural for a place so deep in the woods. After waiting for a few minutes, I decided to go around the side of the cabin and check the back door. That one was unlocked. I stepped inside cautiously, my boots creaking on the old wood floor. The air inside smelled stale and musty, a mix of mildew and something else I couldn't place. I pulled out a flashlight, flicked it on, and started to look around. The first room was the living area, with worn-out furniture and an old stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Dust lay thick on every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners of the room. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, and I winced each time I took a step, afraid I'd fall through. There were a few pieces of broken furniture, nothing unusual for an old cabin that hadn't been maintained. But as I walked deeper into the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I went into the small kitchen, expecting to find more of the same. Abandoned, unused, but the kitchen was strangely tidy. The sink was clean, and the counter was free of debris. The refrigerator, however, was a different story. It stood ominously in the corner, its door slightly ajar, as if someone had been there recently. I hesitated for a moment before opening it, half expecting something horrifying inside. To my relief, it was empty, except for a few cans of food and a bottle of water. I sighed and shook my head. It was just an old place, nothing to worry about. After checking the rest of the downstairs, I climbed the creaky stairs to the second floor. The hallway up top was narrow, and every door seemed to lead to a small bedroom. I entered the first one, which was sparsely furnished with a single bed, a nightstand, and a small dresser. But what caught my attention was a large, antique mirror hanging on the wall, reflecting the dim light from the hallway. I took a step closer, but as I did, I noticed something odd. The reflection in the mirror wasn't quite right. At first, I thought it was just the angle of the light, but there was a shadow in the corner of the room that shouldn't have been there. I turned quickly, my heart racing, but the room was empty. I felt a chill run down my spine. The rest of the rooms upstairs were just as I expected. Old, unused, and filled with dust. I made my way back downstairs, thinking I'd get to work on the furniture and get out of there as quickly as possible. It was when I walked back into the living room that I heard something. A faint sound, like someone moving around upstairs. I froze, listening intently. The sound stopped for a moment, and I thought maybe it was just the wind. But then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, as though someone was walking around in one of the rooms above. I wasn't imagining things. I could hear them clearly. Someone was upstairs. My heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't one to get scared easily, but this felt off. There were no other cars outside, and I had heard no voices when I arrived. I hadn't seen anyone else come in either, but still, the footsteps continued, one after another, slowly moving across the floor above me. I grabbed my toolbox and moved towards the stairs, trying to be as quiet as possible. The feeling of being watched crept up on me, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I reached the bottom of the stairs and hesitated for a moment before making my way up, each step creaking under my weight. When I reached the top, the footsteps stopped. I stood in the hallway, listening for any sound, any movement, but there was nothing. The silence was suffocating. I pushed open the first bedroom door. Empty. No one was there. I did the same for the next room, then the third. Still nothing. But the last door at the end of the hall, it was closed. I didn't remember it being closed before. My heart raced again as I slowly reached for the door handle. I turned it and pushed the door open. The room was dark, but I could make out the shape of something lying on the floor. I flicked on my flashlight and aimed it at the figure. It was an old man, lying face down on the floor, his clothes torn, his skin pale. He was motionless. I rushed over to him, kneeling beside the body. There was no pulse, no sign of life. I didn't know who he was, but he didn't belong here. I felt a strange mixture of fear and confusion. How had he ended up here? There was no way he could have come in while I was working. The door had been locked when I arrived. I stood up quickly, my mind racing. I needed to leave. I grabbed my tools and headed for the door. Just as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard the unmistakable sound of a door slamming shut upstairs. I ran out of the cabin without looking back. I didn't care if the job wasn't finished. I just needed to get away. I jumped into my truck, slammed the door shut, and floored the gas pedal. I never went back to that cabin, and I never asked Dave about it either. The police never found out what happened, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever was in that cabin, whatever I heard and saw that day, it was real, and I was lucky to get out alive. It had been a long time since I'd ventured out into the woods. Years, in fact. But when my old friend Charlie called and asked if I wanted to go out to his cabin, I figured I could use the break. Work had been stressing me out, and the city was beginning to feel suffocating. A few days away in nature, in isolation, sounded like exactly what I needed. Charlie was a quiet guy, the kind of person who could disappear for days or weeks at a time without anyone really noticing. He'd built a cabin deep in the woods of northern Pennsylvania years ago, far off any beaten path, with no real neighbors for miles. It wasn't a luxury cabin by any means. It was small, practical, and meant for solitude, not comfort. But that was the appeal, wasn't it? A break from everything, a reset. The drive up was uneventful. Just the long stretch of highway, then the narrow, winding roads cutting through the woods. The kind of roads where your tires could easily slip off if you weren't careful. I made it up just before sunset, the sky a pale orange as I navigated the final few miles. I'd barely seen another car, which didn't bother me. The more isolated, the better. When I pulled up, the cabin looked like something out of an old horror movie. It wasn't falling apart or anything. Charlie had always taken care of it, but it had a worn-down look. The paint was chipped, the windows a little foggy, the wooden beams showing their age. It was set up on a small hill with a view of a creek running 100 yards or so down the slope. The trees around it were dense, the kind of thick forest that swallowed up sound. No birds chirping, no rustling in the underbrush, just the stillness. Charlie was waiting outside. He gave me a nod as I parked the truck and stepped out. He didn't say much, which was typical for him. He was in his mid-40s, tall, with a weathered face and scruffy hair. He had that kind of rugged look that seemed almost out of place in the modern world. "Good to see you," he said finally, a slight smile pulling at the corners of his lips. I nodded back, feeling the weight of the quiet surrounding us. "How've you been?" He shrugged, his eyes scanning the trees around the cabin before meeting mine again. "It's been good. You'll like it here, man. It's quiet, perfect for clearing your head." I followed him inside, the cabin smelling like wood and something faintly musty, but not unpleasant. The space was simple, just a few couches, a small kitchen area, and a stone fireplace at one end. There was a table with maps and old newspapers scattered on it, some of them yellowing with age. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a guy who just needed a place to get away. He showed me to the spare room, a small bedroom with a simple bed, a dresser, and a single window overlooking the woods. The view was peaceful, if you could call it that, just endless green stretching into the horizon. Perfect place to clear your head, I thought. Later that night, we sat in front of the fire, sipping beers. Charlie didn't talk much. He wasn't much of a conversationalist, but I didn't mind the silence. Sometimes just having someone there was enough. We'd been friends for years, but we didn't need to fill the space with words. The fire crackled, and the shadows in the cabin danced across the walls. It wasn't uncomfortable, but something felt off. The cabin had a strange kind of stillness to it, the kind that creeps into your bones when you realize how quiet the world around you really is. I thought I heard something outside. Maybe an animal, a branch snapping underfoot. But when I looked out the window, all I saw was the blackness of the trees, unmoving. Charlie must have noticed my glance because he looked up and gave me a half smile. "You'll get used to it. It's just the woods. They're alive in their own way." I didn't respond, just took another sip of my beer. My eyes drifted back to the fire, the flames dancing in the hearth. A strange feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. I brushed it off. It was probably just the isolation, the change of environment. It wasn't like I had never been in the woods before. We went to bed early, the kind of early you do when there's nothing else to do but sleep. The wind outside had picked up, and the sound of the trees swaying in the breeze created a low, rhythmic noise. I lay in the bed, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the night. That's when I heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound, like something scraping against the wood. I told myself it was just the wind, or a branch, or maybe the house settling. But then it came again. This time it was louder, closer. I sat up in bed, my heart starting to race. It was too dark to see anything outside, and the window wasn't big enough to get a clear view. I thought about getting up to check, but something held me there, an instinct, maybe, a sense that I shouldn't move. The sound stopped. I waited in the silence, straining my ears for any sign of movement, but all I could hear was the wind rustling the trees. My mind was playing tricks on me, I decided. It had to be. The next morning, I woke up with a strange unease in my chest. The sunlight filtered in through the window, casting soft shadows on the walls. It was peaceful again, but that feeling from the night before still lingered. Charlie was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He didn't say anything about the noises I'd heard, which made me feel like I might have imagined them. But then, he said something that caught me off guard. "You know, this place, it's got a history, not a good one." I looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes distant. "People used to live here long before I bought it. Family, but something happened to them. Never found out what. All I know is that after they left, no one's been up here for years." I raised an eyebrow, unsure if he was joking. "What happened to them?" He just shrugged. "I don't know. No one does. They say it's bad luck around here, but I've never felt anything wrong. I mean, I wouldn't stay up here if I thought something was really off." I didn't say anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the cabin. It was the way the woods seemed to press in around it, like they were hiding something. We spent the day outside, hiking and exploring the surrounding area. Charlie was right about one thing. It was peaceful. No distractions, no city noise. Just the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. But as the sun began to set, I felt that unease again, like something was watching us, lurking just out of sight. That night, we sat outside by a small campfire. The air was cool, and the sky was clear. The stars shone bright, but there was something in the distance, something off about the woods that I couldn't put my finger on. I glanced over at Charlie, but he seemed lost in his thoughts, his gaze fixed on the flames. The fire crackled, and I was about to ask him if he had any more stories about the place when I heard it again. That faint scraping sound, closer this time, like something or someone was moving around the cabin. I felt my pulse quicken. I tried to ignore it, but the sound kept getting louder. I stood up, feeling the weight of the night pressing in around me. "Charlie," I said, my voice low, "do you hear that?" He didn't answer at first, just stared out at the trees. Then, finally, he nodded slowly. "Yeah, I hear it. It's probably just an animal. Maybe a raccoon or something." But I wasn't convinced. There was something about the sound that wasn't right. It was too deliberate, too methodical. It wasn't the sound of an animal at all. We both sat in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound breaking the stillness of the night. My eyes kept darting toward the trees, watching for any sign of movement. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The scraping stopped suddenly, replaced by the faintest thud, like something had dropped from the trees. I jumped, and Charlie seemed to snap out of his trance. "Let's head inside," he said, his tone a little sharper than usual. "It's late." I didn't argue. We gathered up our things and made our way back to the cabin, the feeling of unease hanging heavily between us. When we got inside, Charlie locked the door behind us. He didn't say much after that, but I could tell he wasn't exactly calm either. I lay awake that night, unable to shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there. The wind howled outside, and the trees creaked in the darkness. And just before I drifted off to sleep, I thought I heard something, soft, almost imperceptible, like a whisper on the wind, a rustling in the woods. The next morning, Charlie acted like nothing had happened. He was quiet as usual, but I could see that something had changed. He was on edge, watching the woods around us with a new wariness that I hadn't noticed before. We spent the rest of the day preparing to leave. I wasn't about to stick around any longer. Whatever was out there, it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't just my imagination. Something was wrong with that place, and I had no intention of finding out what. We packed up our things and left, the woods seeming to close in behind us as we drove away. The further we got, the lighter I felt. It was like I could breathe again. And though I didn't ask Charlie about it again, I knew. Something was out there. Something had been watching us. I was 34 years old when I bought the cabin. It was a rough time in my life. The year was 2017. I had just left a long, messy relationship and moved back to my hometown in southern Ohio. I wasn't close to anyone anymore. Most of my old friends had moved on, gotten married, left the state. My parents lived 2 hours away and we didn't talk much. I had some savings and a desperate need to get away. So when I found the listing for an old, cheap cabin in a rural county I barely remembered visiting as a kid, I didn't hesitate. The price was dirt cheap, and I figured I could fix it up myself over a few months. Maybe even stay there longer if I liked it. The listing barely mentioned that the cabin sat just a few hundred yards from an old graveyard, one of those half-forgotten pioneer cemeteries you sometimes see out here, tucked into a corner of the woods. At the time, I didn't think twice about it. I was more focused on the price and the pictures. An old, square-shaped cabin with sagging wood, a little covered porch, and a half-acre of woods all around it. It looked peaceful, secluded, exactly what I thought I needed. The first time I saw it in person, it was late March. The trees were still bare, the ground a soggy mess from recent rains. The road that led to the cabin was just a gravel lane, pitted and washed out. My old pickup groaned over the potholes as I drove the last mile. The cabin looked rougher in person. The wood was gray and weathered. The porch leaned forward slightly, and some of the windows were cracked. Still, it had charm. You could tell someone had cared about the place once. There was even an old, rusted rocking chair on the porch, though it looked like it hadn't been used in years. The graveyard was harder to miss than I expected. It sat about 200 yards behind the cabin, just over a little rise. There were maybe 30 stones, most of them crooked or broken, their writing faded by time. A couple of the larger markers leaned against each other like old men too tired to stand. A sagging wire fence surrounded it, though whole sections had fallen down. The woods pressed close all around, making the clearing feel small and lonely. I told myself it didn't bother me. People get buried everywhere. A graveyard's just a place. Stones and bones. Nothing to be afraid of. I signed the papers the next week. The first month passed quietly. I spent my days cleaning out the cabin, hauling out trash, repairing the porch, patching up the leaks in the roof. At night, I'd sit by the little wood stove, reading or listening to the old radio I found tucked away in a cabinet. There was no cell signal out there, no TV reception. It was just me and the woods. Sometimes I'd sit outside and watch the trees move in the wind, the sky stretching black and endless overhead. I told myself I liked the peace, but I didn't sleep well. First, it was just the noises. The cabin popped and creaked at night, the way old buildings do when the temperature drops. The woods were full of sounds too, distant rustlings, the snap of branches underfoot. I tell myself it was just animals, deer, raccoons, maybe a coyote. I kept a loaded .38 in the drawer by my bed just in case, but I never had to use it. Still, I'd find myself waking up 4 times a night, heart pounding for no reason. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps outside the cabin. Light, slow ones, just a few steps, then nothing. I'd sit there in bed, holding my breath, listening so hard it hurt. But I never saw anything when I looked out the window. The second month, things got worse. One evening, early May, I went out to chop some firewood. The sun was going down, turning the sky a deep gold. I had just split a few logs when I caught something out of the corner of my eye. Movement up by the graveyard. I turned, axe in hand. At first, I didn't see anything. Just the leaning stones, the broken fence, the tangled grass. Then I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the graveyard fence, half hidden among the trees, still as a statue. It was too far to make out clearly, maybe 50 yards, but it looked like a man, tall, thin, wearing something dark, maybe a coat or maybe just shadows. Couldn't tell. He wasn't moving. He just stood there, facing me. I stared for a long time, heart thudding. Finally, I called out. I didn't even think about it, just shouted a gruff, "Hey!" across the clearing. The figure didn't move. I set down the axe and started walking toward the graveyard, keeping my eyes on him the whole time. About halfway there, I blinked, just a second, and when I looked again, he was gone. I stopped, listened, looked around. Nothing. I told myself it was a trick of the light. Shadows. Maybe a tree stump that looked human from the right angle. I walked all the way to the graveyard fence, peered into the woods. There was no one there. The woods were quiet, just the occasional chirp of a bird, the whisper of the wind. Still, I didn't chop any more wood that night. After that, I started noticing other things, little things. One morning, I woke up and found muddy footprints on the porch. They were faint, like someone had been walking around after a rainstorm, barefoot. I thought maybe it was an animal at first, a raccoon, a stray dog, but the prints were too big, too human. Another night, I came back from town. I'd driven in to get groceries and found the front door slightly open. I knew I had locked it. I was sure, but there it was, swinging gently in the breeze. Inside, nothing seemed missing, but the thought of someone going through my things made my skin crawl. I started locking the door with a heavy deadbolt I installed myself. I nailed the windows shut. At night, I kept the .38 within arm's reach, but the feeling of being watched never went away. One evening, I decided to walk up to the graveyard just before sunset. I wanted to prove to myself there was nothing to be afraid of, that it was just an old patch of ground and stones, nothing more. The grass was knee-high, thick and tangled. The stones leaned at crazy angles. Some had crumbled entirely. Most of the names and dates were too faded to read, but a few were still clear. Infant daughter, 1883. Sarah G., 1851 to 1874. William M., 1809 to 1865. I wandered among the graves, feeling uneasy but determined. The woods pressed close around the clearing, the trees tall and dark against the sky. Then I noticed something, a fresh patch of dirt, right near the center of the graveyard, behind a tall, cracked headstone. The ground had been disturbed. The grass was torn up, the dirt loose and dark, like someone had been digging. Recently, there was no grave marker there, no reason anyone should have touched it. I stared at the disturbed ground for a long time. Then I heard a sound, a soft, scraping noise from the woods beyond the graveyard. I turned, heart hammering. There was someone there. I was sure of it. I couldn't see them, but I could feel their presence like a weight on my chest. Watching, waiting. I backed away slowly, then turned and walked, not ran, just walked, back to the cabin. I didn't look back. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing noises outside, footsteps, breathing. Once, I thought I heard the porch boards creak, like someone shifting their weight outside the door. I lay there in the dark, gun in hand, every muscle locked tight. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The next day, I decided I had to do something. I wasn't crazy. Someone was messing with me. I didn't know why. Maybe a drifter, maybe some sick local playing games, but I wasn't about to sit around and wait for things to get worse. I drove into town and talked to the sheriff's office. They were polite but dismissive, said they'd send a deputy out to take a look, but made it clear they didn't think much of my story. Probably kids, they said. Probably nothing. No one came that night, or the night after. By the third night, I was on edge, snapping at every little sound. It was raining, a cold, steady drizzle that blurred the world outside the windows. I sat in the living room with the stove burning low, the .38 on the table beside me. Around midnight, I heard it. A knock, soft, barely there, at the front door. I froze. Another knock, a little louder. I picked up the gun and moved to the door, heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't open it. Instead, I called out just one sharp word. Silence. I waited. Then, very slowly, the doorknob started to turn. I raised the gun and shouted, loud and harsh. The knob froze, then footsteps, light, quick, retreating into the rain. I waited 5 minutes before cracking the door open and looking outside. Nothing, just the rain and the dark. The next morning, I found footprints in the mud, barefoot, human, leading from the graveyard to my porch and back again. I knew then I couldn't stay. I packed what little I had, clothes, a few tools, my gun, into the truck and left that afternoon. I didn't even lock the door behind me. I never went back. I sold the cabin to some out-of-state buyer 6 months later. Took a loss on it, but I didn't care. I don't know who or what was out there in those woods watching me, but I do know this: it wasn't a ghost. It wasn't some supernatural thing. It was a person, a real, breathing person. Maybe someone who lived out there, half-feral, hiding in the trees. Maybe someone who thought of the graveyard as theirs. Maybe someone who didn't like me being there. And maybe, just maybe, someone who had already done terrible things. That fresh patch of dirt in the graveyard still haunts me. Because the truth is, I don't think it was an old grave. I think it was a new one. And I think if I had stayed just a few more nights, it would have been mine. It was late October when I decided to take a trip to my uncle's old cabin. The place had been passed down through the family, but nobody had really used it for years. My uncle had been the last to live there, and after he passed away, the cabin was left to sit. I had fond memories of staying there during summer vacations when I was younger, but the thought of spending a night alone there as an adult made me nervous. I was in my late 30s, mid-level career, married with no kids. Life had been full of noise, work, traffic, people. The cabin deep in the woods, seemed like the perfect place to get away from everything for a while. So, on a Saturday morning, I packed up my truck, grabbed a few essentials, and set off. The drive was longer than I remembered. The road to the cabin wound through miles of dense forest, the kind that swallowed sound, leaving only the hum of my engine. I knew the way, but it still felt like the woods were pressing in on me from all sides. The cabin was about 2 hours outside of town, located on a plot of land my uncle had bought decades ago. It wasn't much, just a small, weathered structure that had seen better days. There were a few old tools around the yard, long and used and covered in rust, and the porch creaked as I stepped onto it. The cabin itself was simple. Wooden beams, a tin roof, and a couple of windows that let in little light. I took a deep breath and made my way inside, the smell of old pine and dust filling my lungs. The furniture looked like it had been left exactly where my uncle had last placed it. The couches covered in faded blankets, the kitchen stocked with a few cans of food that had long since passed their expiration date. I wasn't planning on staying too long, just one night to clear my head, but I knew it was going to be an interesting experience. The first few hours passed quietly. I spent the afternoon unpacking and setting up a fire in the old wood stove. The fire crackled and popped, its warmth chasing away the chill that had settled in the cabin. Outside, the wind started to pick up, and dark clouds began to roll in. I knew the forecast had called for rain, but there was something about the way the sky had darkened so quickly that unsettled me. As night began to fall, I could feel the atmosphere shift. It wasn't just the storm that was coming. It felt like the world around me was holding its breath. The wind howled, rattling the windows and shaking the trees. I sat by the fire, reading a book I had brought along. Every so often, I would hear a strange creaking noise from the roof or the floorboards. At first, I dismissed it as the house settling, but there was something different about it. By the time the rain started, the storm had picked up in intensity. I could hear the sound of it pounding against the roof and windows. It was like being trapped inside a drum. The wind howled through the trees, and the occasional crack of thunder shook the walls. There was a strange sense of isolation out here that I hadn't expected. The kind of isolation that wasn't peaceful but oppressive. I stayed up late, watching the storm from the windows, trying to make sense of the growing unease in my stomach. The storm was fierce, the kind that makes you second-guess the strength of the roof over your head. By midnight, I decided to turn in. I doused the fire, though the glow from the embers still lingered. I closed the shutters and locked the door, more out of habit than necessity. The first few hours of sleep were fitful. Every gust of wind seemed to shake the cabin, every crack of thunder sending a jolt of fear through me. I lay there in the dark, trying to convince myself that everything was fine, that it was just a storm, just a quiet night in an old cabin. But as I turned over to adjust myself, I thought I heard something, a noise from outside, something more than just the wind. I froze. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but I could hear it. Something scraping against the cabin's wooden walls. I held my breath, straining to listen. It was coming from the side of the house, the side that faced the forest. The sound was rhythmic, almost like something was dragging along the ground. I got up slowly, the cold wooden floor creaking beneath my feet. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and stepped toward the door. My heart was racing. The idea of opening the door in the middle of the night, in the middle of a storm, didn't sit well with me, but my curiosity pushed me forward. I cracked the door open, shining the light outside. The rain had slowed, but the wind still howled through the trees. I scanned the area, my flashlight bouncing across the yard. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. No animal tracks, no signs of anyone being there. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. I closed the door quietly and locked it, returning to bed. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to fall asleep, but every little sound made my pulse quicken. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sky was overcast, the air damp, but the world felt quieter. I decided to get up, make some coffee, and explore the grounds around the cabin. I stepped outside, my boots sinking slightly into the muddy earth as I made my way around to the back of the house. The woods were dense here, the trees towering above, their branches twisting and reaching like arms in the fog. As I walked, I noticed a trail through the underbrush that hadn't been there the day before. The ground was soft and wet from the rain, but the trail was clear, fresh footprints, large and heavy, like someone had been walking through the woods recently. My heart sank. The cabin had always been isolated, but there was something about the way the prints were spaced, like they were deliberate, like someone had been pacing around the house. I followed the trail for a while, my breath catching in my throat with every step. The prints led deeper into the woods, but they were soon lost among the thickets. I turned back, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The rest of the day was uneventful. I kept myself busy, chopping wood, fixing up a few things around the cabin. But when the sun began to set, that same feeling crept back. The wind picked up again, and I couldn't shake the idea that someone was out there, watching me. I shut the cabin down early, locking the windows, bolting the door. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the wind. The storm hadn't returned, but the sense of unease had only grown. I couldn't explain it, but every creak, every whisper of wind against the cabin felt like a warning. Just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard something, a sound that didn't belong. A knock, soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Came from the front door. My heart stopped. I waited, holding my breath. The knocking came again. It wasn't the wind. Someone was outside. I grabbed the flashlight, creeping silently across the room. My mind raced. Who could be out there? The nearest neighbor was miles away. I peeked through the curtains, the light from the flashlight trembling in my hand. There was nothing. I stood there for a long time, staring into the empty night, unsure of what to do. Finally, I lowered the flashlight. Maybe it had been an animal or my mind playing tricks on me. I returned to bed, my mind spinning. The night passed uneventfully after that, though I didn't sleep much. By morning, I had made up my mind to leave. Something about the place didn't feel right anymore. I packed up my things, and as I started the truck, I took one last look at the cabin. The woods behind it were quiet, still, as if nothing had happened. But as I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. There, standing at the edge of the trees, was a figure. It was just standing there, watching. No movement, no sound, just a shape in the distance. I didn't stop. I drove straight back to town, my hands gripping the wheel tighter with every mile. When I finally got home, I told myself it was all in my head. The storm, the strange noises, the figure. It was just the isolation getting to me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, something I hadn't been able to see fully, something that had been waiting, watching. I didn't go back to the cabin after that, and I haven't been back since. I was 29 when I decided to take a solo trip out to a cabin my uncle owned in northern Utah. It was October 2014, and the summer had just broken into early fall. The air was cool enough in the mornings to see your breath, but by afternoon, it was still warm enough to go without a jacket. I had been dealing with a rough year, work stress, a breakup, bills piling up, and needed to get away from it all for a while. My uncle, who wasn't really my uncle but more like an old family friend, offered me his cabin for a week. Said it would do me good to get out of the city for a bit. I didn't argue. The cabin was way up in the foothills, about an hour's drive past a town called Morgan. From there, It was another 15 miles down a dirt road that barely looked traveled. No cell service. No Wi-Fi. Not even a landline. The kind of place you had to check in at the gas station before heading out, just so someone would know where you were in case something happened. The first time I saw the place, it looked exactly like the kind of cabin you see on old postcards. One story, wide front porch with a sagging roof, a little stone chimney on one side, pine trees packed in thick all around it, a small clearing around the cabin, maybe 20 or 30 yards out in all directions, then just solid woods. An old rusted pickup was parked off to the side, sunk into the dirt with flat tires. Inside was dusty but cozy. One main room with a couch and fireplace, a tiny kitchen off to the side, and a bedroom tucked away behind a door at the back. The bathroom was just an outhouse about 100 feet out into the trees. The first couple days were peaceful. I woke up with the sun, cooked simple meals on the propane stove, hiked around during the day, and read books by lantern light at night. The quiet out there was something else. Not the kind of quiet you get in the middle of the night in a city. Out there, it felt heavy, like the woods themselves were pressing down around you. Every little snap of a branch or flutter of wings sounded sharp and close. It was around the third night when things started feeling off. I had just finished eating a late dinner, some canned beef stew heated up over the stove, and was sitting on the porch in one of those old creaky chairs, wrapped up in a heavy blanket. The stars were insanely bright, no light pollution to wash them out. The woods around me were dark, black even once you stepped more than a few feet away from the porch light. It was getting cold enough that I could see the steam from my breath hanging in the air. Somewhere out in the trees, I heard a rustling. Not unusual. Plenty of animals lived out there. Deer, raccoons, even black bears sometimes. I didn't think much of it, but after a few minutes, it started again. Closer this time, a sort of crunching sound, like footsteps moving over dry leaves. I leaned forward, peering into the dark, but couldn't see anything beyond the wall of trees. Another few minutes went by. Then I heard it again, this time from a different direction, like something circling the clearing. I told myself it was just a deer, or maybe a couple of them. That made sense. They probably smelled my dinner and got curious. Still, I decided to head inside and lock the door behind me. Better safe than sorry. That night, I slept like shit. I kept waking up, feeling like something was watching me. Every little creak of the cabin made me jolt awake. At one point, I could have sworn I heard footsteps outside the bedroom window. Slow, deliberate, crunch, crunch, crunch across the dead leaves. But when I finally worked up the nerve to look, there was nothing there. Just the darkness and the faint sway of the tree branches in the wind. The next morning, I found tracks in the clearing. Not animal tracks, not even close. They were barefoot prints, human-shaped but wrong somehow. The toes were too long, the ball of the foot too wide, like a human footprint stretched out and twisted. The prints circled the cabin twice, then disappeared back into the woods. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. The air felt colder than it should have been. I kept telling myself it had to be some weird trick of erosion, or maybe someone had come through and the tracks just looked weird because of the way the ground was drying out. But the longer I looked at them, the less I believed that. I decided to carry a heavy piece of firewood around with me that day, just in case. I didn't have a gun, but a good hard swing from a log could do some damage if it came to that. By that evening, I had almost convinced myself it was just some drifter passing through, maybe a hunter or some local nutcase. I stayed inside, double-checked the locks, and pulled the couch in front of the door just to be extra sure. I tried reading again, but couldn't focus. Every little sound outside made my skin crawl. At some point around midnight, I woke up on the couch to the sound of tapping. Light, almost polite tapping on the window right next to the front door. 3 taps, then a pause. 3 more taps. My heart was hammering in my chest. I stayed completely still, hardly even breathing. After what felt like an eternity, the tapping stopped. Then came the footsteps again, slow and heavy, moving around the porch. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the first pale light of morning crept into the sky, I finally dared to move. I pulled the couch away from the door, yanked it open, and bolted outside. Nothing. No one. But the footprints were back. Fresh ones, circling the cabin again, and this time they led out toward the treeline and stopped. Just ended, right at the edge of the woods, like whoever or whatever it was had vanished into thin air. I spent most of that day packing up my stuff. I had planned to stay a full week, but no way was I doing that now. I didn't care how peaceful it was supposed to be. Something was out there, and I didn't want to find out what it was. By late afternoon, I had everything crammed back into the truck. Problem was, the dirt road back to town had turned into a muddy mess from a rainstorm the night before. The truck's tires just spun uselessly in the muck when I tried to drive out. I tried laying branches and rocks under the tires, tried digging a path with my hands, but nothing worked. I wasn't going anywhere that night. The sun was already dipping low, turning the sky a sickly orange, and the thought of another night out there made me feel sick. I locked myself in the cabin again and pushed the couch back in front of the door. That night, things escalated. It started just after dark. I was sitting in the middle of the room, clutching the firewood like a bat, listening. At first, it was the same as before. Footsteps outside, slow, circling. But then they started getting louder, heavier, like whoever was out there wasn't trying to be sneaky anymore. I could hear them coming right up to the porch, pacing back and forth. Something scratched at the wood. Long, dragging scratches like nails or claws. Then came the thud. A heavy, bone-jarring thud right against the door, hard enough to make it rattle in its frame. Then again, and again. It wasn't like they were trying to pick the lock. It was more like they wanted to break the whole thing down. I sat there frozen, breathing through my nose so I wouldn't make a sound. After what felt like hours, the pounding stopped. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Then, slowly, I heard it, the soft creak of the window by the kitchen. I craned my head around, just enough to see it. Something was outside, pressed up against the glass. A face, but not a normal face. It was stretched too long, with a mouth that hung open too wide, almost like it had been ripped downward. The skin was pale and cracked, like old leather. The eyes were wrong too, way too big, way too dark. It stared into the cabin, its breath fogging up the glass. I stayed as still as I could. My whole body felt like it was made of ice. Eventually, the thing moved away from the window. I heard it shuffle back across the porch, then the crunch of its footsteps fading into the trees. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I was almost delirious from exhaustion. I waited until the sun was high before trying the truck again. Miraculously, the ground had dried just enough that I was able to rocket free and get moving. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't stop for anything. I barreled down that dirt road, mud spraying up behind me, not even caring if I tore the undercarriage out on the rocks and potholes. When I hit the main road, I didn't even stop in Morgan. I just kept driving, straight back to Salt Lake, not stopping until I was in my own driveway. I never went back to that cabin. A few weeks later, my uncle called to ask if I had enjoyed the trip. I told him I cut it short because of the weather. He laughed and said he wasn't surprised. Said he never stayed out there more than a night or two himself. When I asked him why, he just said, "Sometimes the woods don't like visitors." I didn't ask him anything else after that. Life went back to normal, mostly. I still live in the city. I still work my boring office job. I still get stressed about bills and work and everything else. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it again. The slow, steady crunch of footsteps outside my window. I live on the 3rd floor now. No trees nearby. no porch, and I still hear it.